The office was nearly silent now, save for the low hum of the air conditioner and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Sophia sat at her desk, bathed in the cold white glow of her computer screen, her fingers resting limply on the keyboard. The spreadsheet in front of her swam in and out of focus, a jumble of numbers and cells that seemed to mock her for her inability to concentrate. Normally, she could finish this task in no time, her mind sharp and clear, slicing through data like a knife through butter. But tonight was different. Tonight, her mind was somewhere else. Her thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and longing that made even the simplest of tasks feel impossible. Outside, the city had long since wound down. The building was quiet, eerily so, with the usual bustle of voices and footsteps replaced by the distant murmur of a janitor's vacuum cleaner. It was past 9 and the office was nearly deserted. Most of her co-workers had left hours ago, their cheerful goodbyes echoing faintly in her memory. She had waved them off, promising she wouldn't stay too late, but that promise, like so many others she had made to herself lately, had been broken. The truth was, she wasn't staying late for the work. The task she was pretending to finish could easily wait until morning. No, what kept her here, tethered to her desk long after she should have gone home, was something else entirely, or rather someone else. Liam. Just thinking his name sent a strange thrill through her, a warmth that spread through her chest and down into her stomach, leaving a fluttering, nervous energy in its wake. It wasn't that he was particularly handsome, although he was certainly attractive. No, it was something deeper, something intangible, a magnetism that seemed to pull her toward him, even when she knew she should resist. She had always respected him, admired him even. He was her boss, after all, and a damn good one at that. In the 3 years they had worked together, Liam had proven himself to be not only a competent leader, but also someone who genuinely cared about his team. He pushed them to be better, to reach further, and under his guidance, Sophia had excelled. She had risen quickly within the company, earning promotions and praise that she knew in large part were because of him. And yet, somewhere along the way, that respect had shifted into something more, something deeper. It wasn't just admiration anymore, wasn't just professional. It was personal, intensely personal. The change had been subtle at first. A look held a little too long, a touch that lingered for a moment more than necessary. His compliments, once casual and work-related, had taken on a different tone. There was something in his eyes when he looked at her now, something that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, as if he could see right through the professional facade she wore every day. And the worst part was, she couldn't stop thinking about him either. Sophia had tried to dismiss it at first. Liam was married after all. Happily married as far as anyone could tell. His wife, Claire, was beautiful and successful, and from everything Liam had ever said, their relationship was solid. He mentioned her often enough in passing, little comments about weekend plans, vacations, or dinners they had together. Sophia had never given much thought to Claire, not until recently anyway. Lately, every mention of her name sent a pang of guilt through Sophia's chest, a reminder that whatever was happening between her and Liam was wrong. So very, very wrong. And yet, despite that guilt, despite the rational part of her brain that screamed at her to stop this before it went too far, she couldn't help the way her heart raced when he was near, the way her body reacted to his presence. She told herself that it was just a crush, a silly, fleeting infatuation that would pass with time. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Much more. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen, her pulse quickening when she saw his name. Liam. Still at the office? Just a few simple words, but they sent her heart into overdrive. She stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. He had messaged her dozens of times before, of course, about work, meetings, schedules. But tonight felt different. There was an edge to it, a weight in those 4 words that made her stomach flutter in anticipation and anxiety. She could say she was just leaving, that she had already packed up and was heading out the door. That would be the smart thing to do, the responsible thing. But she hesitated. Her fingers lingered over the keys, torn between what she should do and what she wanted to do. Finally, she made her decision. Sophia. Yeah, just finishing up. Her phone buzzed again almost immediately, and she felt a shiver run down her spine as she read his response. Liam, mind if I come by your desk? Sophia's heart was pounding now, her hands trembling slightly as she typed out her reply. She knew she should say no, that nothing good could come from this. But some invisible force, stronger than her will, stronger than her common sense, pushed her to type a single word. Sophia. Sure. The seconds ticked by agonizingly slowly as she waited, her breath shallow, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts and none at all. She heard the soft thud of his footsteps long before she saw him. Each step seemed to reverberate through the empty office, growing louder and louder in her head, until finally he was there. He appeared in the doorway, his tall frame casting a shadow across her desk. The usual ease with which he carried himself seemed even more pronounced in the stillness of the empty office. He didn't smile, not exactly, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel as though he didn't need to. Sophia, he said softly, his voice low and intimate in the quiet room. She swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Liam, she replied, her voice steady, though her heart was anything but. He leaned casually against the edge of her desk, his arms crossed over his chest as he regarded her. There it was again, that look. The one that made her feel like he could see right through her, like he knew exactly what she was thinking, what she was feeling. It was unnerving, and yet she couldn't look away. You're always the last one here, he said, his tone gentle, almost teasing. She smiled weakly, though the tension in her chest made it hard to breathe. Just trying to get everything ready for the presentation tomorrow. Liam nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. You always go above and beyond. That's one of the things I admire most about you. Admire? The word hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Sophia's stomach flipped and she felt her breath catch in her throat. This was it. This was the moment where everything changed. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The tension in the air between them was palpable, like a live wire humming just beneath the surface, waiting to snap. His gaze was so intense, so penetrating, that it took everything she had not to look away. And then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers as they rested on the desk. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of heat through her body. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like so much more. Sophia's breath hitched in her throat. Every fibre of her being was telling her to pull away, to stop this before it went too far, but she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, frozen in place by the overwhelming need that had been building inside her for weeks. Liam's eyes darkened, and his hand lingered against hers for a moment longer before he finally pulled it away. The loss of contact was almost painful, and Sophia had to bite her lip to keep from reaching out to him again. He didn't move away from the desk, didn't step back, but instead leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I can't stop thinking about you. The words sent a shockwave through her, her heart hammering so loudly in her chest she was sure he could hear it. She had known this was coming. She had felt it in every lingering glance, every hesitant touch, every unspoken word between them. But hearing it out loud made it real in a way she hadn't been prepared for. You shouldn't say things like that, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. Liam didn't back down. If anything, he leaned in closer, his gaze never leaving hers. I know, he said softly, but I can't help it. The space between them seemed to shrink with each passing second, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Every rational part of Sophia's brain was screaming at her to stop this, to get up, to leave the office and never look back. But her body refused to listen. She didn't want to listen, and the kiss didn't happen all at once. It began as a whisper of possibility, a subtle leaning into the unspoken tension that had simmered between them for months. As Liam stood there, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin, Sophia's world shrank to just the two of them. The air in the office felt thicker, charged, as if even the walls were aware of what was about to happen. Her mind raced, her internal dialogue a chaotic swirl of panic and desire. She shouldn't be doing this. He shouldn't be doing this. Every part of her knew the consequences that could follow, but that knowledge seemed distant and detached, a weak protest drowned out by the thudding of her heart in her ears. Liam's hand moved slowly, tentatively, as if he too was unsure whether to close the distance. But his eyes never left hers, searching, waiting for a sign, any sign, that she felt the same. His fingers brushed lightly over her arm, the touch so faint it felt almost accidental, but the electric shock it sent through her body was undeniable. It was as if her skin had been starved for this kind of touch, for this kind of connection. "I know we shouldn't," he began, his voice rough, barely a whisper. Sophia nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She wanted to tell him to stop, to remind him of Claire, of the line they were about to cross. But no words came. Instead, she found herself leaning into the moment, into him, as if some force stronger than her own will was guiding her. "I don't want to stop," he finished, his eyes searching hers for confirmation. She could feel the tension pulling them together, like gravity, an inevitable force that neither of them had the strength to resist anymore. Her breath hitched as his fingers slid upward, grazing the side of her neck, leaving a trail of warmth in their wake. He paused there just for a second, as if giving her one final chance to pull away, to stop this before it was too late. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she tilted her face upward, her lips parting slightly in anticipation, and that was all the encouragement he needed. The kiss, when it finally came, was soft at first, almost hesitant. Liam's lips barely brushed hers, testing the waters, as if afraid the moment might shatter if he pushed too hard, too fast. Sophia's heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, guilt, excitement, fear, desire, all colliding in a storm of sensation. His hand cupped her jaw, the warmth of his palm seeping into her skin, grounding her in the moment. And then slowly the kiss deepened. What started as a tentative, almost fragile connection quickly grew into something more intense, more desperate. The weight of their long suppressed feelings surged to the surface, and the kiss became a release, a way for them to finally acknowledge everything they had been holding back. Sophia felt herself melting into him, her body responding instinctively as her hands reached up to grasp the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. It was everything she had imagined it would be and more, the feel of his lips against hers, the way his arms wrapped around her, pulling her up from her chair and into his embrace. It was overwhelming, intoxicating. She knew this was wrong, that they were crossing a line they could never uncross, but in that moment, she didn't care. All that mattered was the way he made her feel, the way he seemed to fit perfectly against her, as if they had been made for this moment. Liam's hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer still, and she felt herself responding in kind, her body pressed against his as the kiss deepened. There was a hunger in the way he kissed her now, a kind of desperation that mirrored her own, as if they were both trying to make up for all the time they had spent denying this, denying each other. For a few blissful moments, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no office, no spreadsheets, no deadlines. There was no Claire, no marriage, no consequences. There was only Liam, his lips on hers, his hands in her hair, the heat of his body against hers. And in that moment, it felt perfect. But perfection never lasts. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other as they struggled to come back to reality. The weight of what they had just done began to settle in, and Sophia felt a pang of guilt twist in her chest. She could see the same conflict in Liam's eyes, the battle between what they wanted and what they knew was right. "We can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling as the reality of their actions hit her like a tidal wave. "I know," Liam replied, but his hands didn't loosen their hold on her waist. If anything, his grip tightened slightly, as if afraid to let her go. "But I don't want to stop." Sophia closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. Part of her wanted to run, to flee the office and never look back. But another part of her, a part that had been growing louder with each passing day, wanted to stay, to give in to the temptation that had been building for so long. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the silence thick with unspoken emotions. Sophia knew this was dangerous, knew that if they continued down this path, there would be no turning back. But even as the guilt gnawed at her, even as the logical part of her mind screamed at her to end this now, her heart whispered something else entirely. She didn't want to stop either. From that night on, everything between them changed. The office no longer felt like a safe, neutral space where they could interact as colleagues and nothing more. Every glance, every brush of his hand against hers, every shared smile now carried a weight, a secret that only the two of them shared. They were careful, of course, so careful. There were no public displays of affection, no overt signs of their growing relationship. But the tension between them was impossible to hide, at least from each other. It started with stolen glances across the conference room, brief moments where their eyes would meet, and the air between them would crackle with unspoken longing. They found excuses to be alone together, late-night meetings, lunch breaks that stretched longer than they should have. In those stolen moments, they allowed themselves to be honest about what they wanted, what they felt. Each secret meeting only fueled the fire that had ignited between them. When they were alone, it was as if the outside world no longer existed. Their hands would find each other almost instinctively, their kisses filled with the same urgency as that first night. But there was always a sense of danger lurking beneath the surface, a constant reminder that what they were doing was wrong, that they were risking everything. And yet, despite the risks, despite the guilt that gnawed at her every time she saw Claire's photo on Liam's desk or heard him mention her in passing, Sophia couldn't stop. She didn't want to stop. The way Liam made her feel, special, desired, like she was the only woman in the world, was intoxicating, and she found herself falling deeper into the affair with each passing day. But they weren't as careful as they thought. The rumours started innocuously enough, just whispers in the break room, quiet conversations that Sophia dismissed as harmless gossip. She had always known that office chatter could be brutal, especially in a company as tight-knit as theirs. But when she heard her name paired with Liam's in one of those hushed conversations, her stomach dropped. It was a Friday afternoon and she had ducked into the break room to grab a cup of coffee. As she waited for the machine to finish brewing, she overheard two of her colleagues, Amy and Jennifer, talking in low voices by the window. Normally she wouldn't have paid any attention to their conversation, but when she heard Liam's name, followed by her own, she froze. "I heard she's been staying late with him a lot," Amy whispered, her tone laced with curiosity. "Yeah, I've noticed that too," Jennifer replied, her voice equally conspiratorial. "Do you think there's something going on between them?" Sophia's heart sank. She had been careful. They had been careful, hadn't they? She swallowed hard, trying to force herself to act natural, but her hands shook as she poured her coffee. She didn't wait to hear the rest of the conversation. Instead, she fled the break room as quickly as possible, her mind racing. Had someone seen them together? Had they been too reckless? The panic set in almost immediately. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a haze of fear and paranoia, convinced that everyone in the office knew, that they were all watching her, judging her. Every time someone looked in her direction, she felt exposed, as if the secret she had fought so hard to keep hidden was written all over her face. By the time she left the office that evening, her nerves were frayed, and she was on the verge of a breakdown. The weekend brought little relief, as she spent every waking moment replaying the last few weeks in her mind, analysing every interaction, every conversation, every glance she had shared with Liam. Had they been too obvious? Had they made a mistake? When Monday rolled around, the rumours hadn't subsided. If anything, they seemed to have grown, the whispers following her wherever she went. She tried to act normal, to pretend that nothing had changed, but it was impossible to ignore the way people looked at her, the knowing glances they exchanged when she walked into the room. She was spiralling and she knew it, but the worst was yet to come. Monday morning arrived like a storm, with tension hanging in the air long before Sophia set foot in the office. She had spent the entire weekend in a state of high anxiety, barely sleeping, her mind consumed with thoughts of the rumours swirling around her and Liam. She'd barely been able to eat, her stomach knotted with fear over what the coming days would bring. Every time her phone buzzed, she expected it to be a message from him, telling her that everything had come crashing down, that they had been caught. But the message never came. The office felt different as soon as she stepped inside, a kind of thick, suffocating energy that made her skin prickle with unease. Colleagues who once greeted her warmly now offered only tight-lipped smiles or avoided her altogether. Conversations abruptly cut off when she walked by, replaced by furtive glances and sidelong stares. It was subtle but unmistakable. Something was wrong. Her heart raced as she made her way to her desk, each step feeling heavier than the last. She tried to keep her head down, to act like nothing was amiss, but the silence that followed her through the office was deafening. Every smile felt forced, every glance laden with judgment. She hadn't realised how quickly rumours could spread, or how merciless they could be. By mid-morning, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. "Liam, we need to talk. Can you come by my office?" The message was brief, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. The panic she'd been suppressing all morning surged forward, nearly choking her as she typed out a quick reply. "Sophia, be right there." Her hands were trembling as she stood from her desk, trying to steady her breathing. She forced herself to walk slowly, deliberately, even though every instinct told her to rush, to figure out what was happening as quickly as possible. The distance to Liam's office felt impossibly long, each step echoing loudly in her head as her pulse quickened with dread. When she reached his office, the door was already slightly ajar. She knocked softly before pushing it open. Liam stood by the window, his back to her, his posture stiff and tense. The blinds were half drawn, casting thin slashes of light across the room. It was a stark contrast to his usual relaxed demeanour, and seeing him like that sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over her. He turned slowly, his face grim, and the knot in Sophia's stomach tightened. "We have a problem," he said quietly without preamble. Sophia closed the door behind her, her mouth dry. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she nodded instead, waiting for him to continue. "HR has been asking questions," Liam said, his voice tight, controlled. "They've heard the rumours. Someone reported us." The air left Sophia's lungs in a rush as if she had been punched in the gut. She felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stay standing, gripping the back of a leather chair for support. She had known this moment was coming, had feared it for weeks, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way that she hadn't been prepared for. What do we do?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam rubbed a hand over his face, his eyes dark and shadowed with stress. "I don't know yet. They haven't said anything directly, but they're investigating. They've called me in for a meeting tomorrow." Sophia felt like the walls were closing in on her. "A meeting? What are they going to ask?" "I don't know," he repeated, his voice sharper than before, frustration creeping in. "But this is serious, Sophia, if they find out about us." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. They both knew what would happen if HR confirmed their affair. The fallout would be catastrophic. Liam would lose his job, possibly even more, given his position. Sophia would be implicated too, her reputation ruined. Even if she wasn't fired, she'd be tainted, her career prospects forever marred by this scandal. The room was thick with tension, the weight of their actions finally bearing down on them. For weeks they had lived in a bubble, pretending that the outside world didn't exist, that they could keep this secret forever. But now that bubble had burst and they were left standing in the wreckage of their choices. "What do you want to do?" she asked, her voice barely audible, as if she were afraid of the answer. Liam turned to face her fully, his expression a mixture of regret and resolve. "We have to end this," he said softly, but the words felt like a knife to her chest. Sophia had known it was coming, had expected it even, but hearing it out loud still stung more than she could have imagined. Her heart clenched painfully, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. This, whatever this was between them, was over. And as much as she had tried to prepare herself for this moment, the finality of it was devastating. "I don't want to lose you," Liam said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I can't risk everything we've built. My career, my family. I can't." Tears pricked the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. She nodded stiffly, trying to keep her composure, but inside, she was crumbling. "I understand," she whispered, even though she didn't. "Not really." He crossed the room then, standing in front of her, so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His hand reached out, gently cupping her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek in a gesture that was both tender and heartbreaking. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice low and strained. Sophia leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief moment as she memorized the feeling of his skin against hers. She wanted to freeze time, to stay in this moment for just a little while longer before everything shattered. But she knew it was futile. They couldn't go back, not now. Liam leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. It wasn't like their other kisses. Those had been filled with heat and passion, a fire that consumed them both. This one was different. This was a goodbye. When he pulled away, the loss of his touch felt like a physical blow. The distance between them suddenly felt unbearable, but Sophia forced herself to take a step back, to create the space that they both knew had to be there now. "I'll talk to HR," Liam said quietly. "I'll do what I can to protect you." Sophia swallowed the lump in her throat, nodding again. She wanted to say something, to offer him comfort, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was watch as he turned away, heading back to his desk, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Without another word, she left his office, the door closing softly behind her. The weight of their decision hung heavy on her shoulders as she made her way back to her desk, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. This was it, the end. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. The HR investigation loomed over them like a dark cloud, and every time Sophia saw Liam in the office, it felt like a punch to the gut. They didn't speak outside of meetings, didn't exchange so much as a glance in the hallways. The distance between them was palpable, and it was killing her. She tried to focus on work, to throw herself into her tasks and pretend that everything was normal, but it was impossible. Her mind was constantly racing, replaying every moment she had shared with Liam, wondering where they had gone wrong, where they had slipped up. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was falling apart, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Then the meeting came. Liam had been called into HR early in the morning, and Sophia had spent the entire day in a state of panic, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She couldn't concentrate on anything, her mind filled with worst-case scenarios. By the time she heard that Liam had left the building, her stomach was in knots. It wasn't until later that afternoon when she received an email from HR herself that her worst fears were confirmed. The message was brief, but the implications were clear. Liam had resigned. Her heart sank as she read the words, her hands shaking as she clicked out of the email. He was gone. Just like that. Everything they had shared, every stolen moment, every whispered confession, was over. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. Tears blurred her vision as she realized the finality of it all. Liam was gone, and with him, the life they had secretly built together. The days that followed were a blur of rumors and quiet stares. The office buzzed with gossip about Liam's sudden resignation, but no one mentioned the real reason. HR had kept the details under wraps, though the rumours were impossible to silence entirely. People speculated, their glances more knowing now, but no one dared to confront her directly. Sophia went through the motions, but she was a shell of herself. The guilt and loss weighed heavily on her, making it difficult to focus, difficult to even care about her job anymore. She heard that Claire had filed for divorce, but the news only made the ache inside her worse. Liam had lost everything, his career, his marriage, because of her. And though he had tried to protect her from the worst of it, she still felt the weight of the consequences bearing down on her. Weeks passed, and the whispers eventually died down, replaced by new office gossip and scandals. But for Sophia, the fallout lingered. Liam was gone, and with him, any sense of normalcy she had once had. She had no idea where he had gone or what he was doing now. All she had left were memories of a love that had burned too bright, too quickly, and left destruction in its wake. She would never forget him, she couldn't, but she would have to find a way to move on, and that was the hardest part of all.